The first thing anyone noticed about him was his eyes. Not brown, not hazel, but a startling shade of pale blue that seemed impossible on a man whose skin marked him as property. In the tobacco fields of Albemarle County, Virginia, where the color of your skin meant everything compared to the color of your eyes, those eyes became a curse. They whispered of secrets no one dared speak aloud. They hinted at bloodlines that should have remained buried. And in the spring of 1851, they would become the center of a scandal so explosive it would end in murder, in courtroom drama, and in a truth that threatened to destroy one of Virginia's most respected families. This is the story of what happened when jealousy, shame, and the brutal realities of slavery collided in a single violent moment that no one could undo. Before we continue with the story of the Hartwell plantation and the tragedy that unfolded there, if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community across America. Now, let's step back into the world of 1851 Virginia, where secrets were currency and some truths were too dangerous to speak. The Hartwell plantation sat 3 miles outside Charlottesville, a sprawling estate of nearly 800 acres, where tobacco grew in neat rows stretching toward the Blue Ridge Mountains on the horizon. At the end of a long drive lined with oak trees stood the main house, a 2-story structure of white painted brick with tall columns supporting a wide veranda. It was the kind of house that announced wealth and permanence, the kind of place built to last for generations. Colonel Edmund Hartwell had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Hartwells had built their fortune on that red Virginia clay, and by 1851, Edmund was considered one of the most successful planters in the county. His tobacco was known for its quality. His horses were prized throughout the state, and his word carried weight in the halls of power in Richmond. He was 47 years old, that spring with graying temples and the kind of stern, dignified bearing that commanded respect at county meetings and church gatherings. He had fought in the Mexican War, earning his colonel's rank through actual service rather than mere courtesy, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen combat and survived. His face was weathered from years of riding through his fields checking on crops and workers, and his hands, though well manicured, bore the calluses of a man who wasn't afraid of physical labor when necessary. Edmund's father, Colonel Thomas Hartwell, had been a formidable figure in his own right, serving in the Virginia House of Delegates and building the family's wealth through shrewd land acquisitions and careful management. He had died in 1845, leaving Edmund not just the plantation, but also a reputation to uphold and a legacy to preserve. The Hartwell name meant something in Albemarle County. It meant stability, honor, tradition. Edmund's wife, Catherine, was 10 years younger, the daughter of a prominent Richmond family whose connections had made the marriage advantageous for both families. She was 37 in 1851, still beautiful in the way that Southern women of her class cultivated. Pale skin protected from the sun, dark hair arranged in the latest fashion, a figure maintained through careful corsetting, and the kind of diet that spoke of privilege. Her manners were impeccable. Her conversation witty without being improper, her management of the household efficient and seemingly effortless. They had been married for 15 years and had 3 children. Margaret, 13 years old and already showing signs of her mother's beauty. Edmund Jr., called Ned, who was 11 and being groomed to take over the plantation someday. And little Sarah, just 7 years old, still young enough to be indulged and spoiled by her father. To anyone looking from the outside, The Hartwells represented everything the Old South claimed to be gracious, prosperous, rooted in tradition and family honor. They attended St. Anne's Episcopal Church every Sunday, sitting in the third pew from the front, the same pew the Hartwells had occupied for 3 generations. They hosted dinner parties that were the highlight of Charlottesville's social season, with tables laden with ham and turkey, and vegetables from their own gardens, wine from Edmund's carefully maintained cellar, and conversation that ranged from politics to literature to the latest news from Europe. Catherine was known as one of the finest hostesses in the county. She had a gift for making guests feel welcome, for orchestrating evenings that flowed smoothly from aperitifs on the veranda to dinner in the formal dining room to coffee and brandy in the parlor. She played the piano beautifully, sang in a clear soprano voice, and could discuss the latest novels from England with the same ease that she could manage the complexities of running a household that included not just her immediate family, but also 43 enslaved people whose lives she controlled with a word. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something had been festering for years. A secret that everyone knew but no one acknowledged. A wound that had never healed, that had only grown more infected with time. The slave quarters at Hartwell Plantation consisted of 12 wooden cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the main house, far enough away to be out of sight, but close enough that the overseer could keep watch. Each cabin housed anywhere from 2 to 6 people, depending on family size. The cabins were simple structures: 1 room with a dirt floor, a fireplace for cooking and heat, a few pieces of rough furniture, and pallets for sleeping. In summer, they were stifling. In winter, they were drafty, but they were home to the 43 people who had no choice but to make the best of what they had. The community in the quarters was tight, knit in the way that shared suffering creates bonds. There were families who had been at Hartwell Plantation for 3 generations, children who had grown up together, couples who had married with the master's permission, old people who remembered when Edmund's grandfather had first cleared the land. They had their own social structure, their own hierarchies and relationships that existed parallel to but separate from the white world of the main house. There were the field hands who worked from dawn to dusk in the tobacco fields, their hands stained brown from handling the leaves, their backs bent from years of stooping and lifting. There were the house slaves who worked in the main house and had a slightly higher status. They wore better clothes, ate better food, and had more contact with the white family. There was the blacksmith, the carpenter, the stable hands, the cook, the laundress. Each person had a role, a place in the system that kept the plantation running. And then there was Daniel. He was 23 years old in the spring of 1851, tall and strong from years of field work. His shoulders were broad, his arms muscled from swinging a hoe and lifting heavy loads. His skin was the color of polished walnut, his hair cut short, his features regular and unremarkable, except for one detail that made him impossible to ignore. His eyes were blue, not the muddy blue, gray, that sometimes appeared in people of mixed ancestry, but a clear, pale blue that seemed to glow against his darker complexion. They were the kind of eyes that made people do a double take, that made them stare even when they knew staring was rude. They were eyes that raised questions no one wanted to answer. Daniel had been born in the quarters in 1828, delivered by the plantation midwife on a cold January night. His mother, Ruth, had been just 19 years old, a kitchen slave who had been born at Hartwell Plantation herself. When the midwife had first seen the baby's eyes, she had gone very quiet. When Ruth had seen them, she had wept. Everyone in the quarters had understood immediately what those eyes meant, and everyone had learned very quickly never to speak of it. Ruth was 42 years old now, still working in the kitchen despite the gray threading through her hair and the stiffness in her joints that came from years of standing over hot stoves and washing dishes in cold water. She was a quiet woman, careful and controlled, who had learned long ago that the safest way to survive was to be as invisible as possible. She never complained, never caused trouble, never drew attention to herself. But she couldn't make her son invisible. Those blue eyes made that impossible. Daniel had grown up knowing he was different. The other slave children had sometimes taunted him about his eyes, calling him names until their parents had hushed them. The white visitors to the plantation had stared at him, some with curiosity, some with disgust, some with a knowing look that made his skin crawl. And Catherine Hartwell had looked at him with pure, undisguised hatred from the moment he was old enough to understand what hatred looked like. He had learned early to keep his head down, his eyes averted, his presence as unobtrusive as possible. He had learned which paths to take to avoid crossing Catherine's line of sight, which times of day to stay far from the main house, which tasks to volunteer for that would keep him in the fields and away from her notice. He had learned to be careful in a way that went beyond the normal caution every slave had to exercise. Because Daniel knew, even if no one ever said it aloud, that Catherine wanted him dead. To understand what happened in the spring of 1851, you have to understand what had happened in the fall of 1836 when Catherine Beaumont had arrived at Hartwell Plantation as Edmund's new bride. She had been 22 years old, the third daughter of Richmond merchant William Beaumont, a man who had made his fortune in the tobacco trade and was eager to see his daughters married well. Catherine had been considered a beauty in Richmond society, dark-haired and pale, skinned with fine features, and a figure that drew admiring glances. She had been educated at one of Richmond's finest schools for young ladies, where she had learned French and music and all the accomplishments expected of a woman of her class. Edmund Hartwell had courted her properly, traveling to Richmond for balls and dinners, presenting himself as a prosperous planter with a fine estate and a respected name. He was 15 years older than Catherine, but that was not unusual for the time. He was handsome in a stern way, well-spoken, clearly wealthy. Catherine's father had approved of the match, and Catherine herself had been swept up in the romance of it all. The handsome planter, the grand estate, the prospect of being mistress of her own household. They had married in October of 1836 in a ceremony at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Richmond that had been attended by all of Richmond's best families. Catherine had worn a dress of white silk with lace from Belgium, and Edmund had worn a new suit tailored in Richmond. The reception had been lavish with champagne and oysters and a cake that stood 3 feet tall. After the wedding, Edmund had brought his new bride home to Hartwell Plantation. Catherine had arrived full of excitement and romantic notions about plantation life. She had imagined herself as the gracious mistress of a grand estate, hosting elegant parties and managing a household with effortless skill. Reality had been different. The plantation was beautiful, certainly, but it was also isolated. Charlottesville was 3 miles away, and Richmond was a full day's journey. The main house was grand, but it was also old with creaking floors and andros and drafty windows, and 1,000 small maintenance issues that no one had bothered to address while Edmund had been living there as a bachelor. The household slaves knew their jobs better than Catherine did, and she quickly realized that they had been running things their own way for years and resented her attempts to impose new systems. And Edmund, she discovered, was not the attentive husband she had imagined. He was kind enough, certainly, but he was also busy. The plantation demanded constant attention. There were fields to manage, crops to plan, workers to supervise, business trips to Richmond and Charlottesville. Edmund spent most of his days on horseback, riding through the fields or meeting with his overseer or traveling to town. He came home tired and distracted, ate his dinner, and often fell asleep in his study over his account books. Catherine had felt lonely and out of place. She had tried to assert her authority as mistress of the household, but the slaves had been polite and obedient, while quietly continuing to do things the way they had always done them. She had tried to interest Edmund in redecorating the house or hosting parties, but he had been preoccupied with the tobacco crop and the falling prices in Richmond. And then, 3 weeks after her arrival, Catherine had noticed something that had made her blood run cold. She had been walking through the yard behind the main house, trying to familiarize herself with the layout of the plantation, when she had seen Edmund talking to one of the kitchen slaves. It was a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, with smooth, dark skin and a slender figure. Edmund had been standing close to her, closer than a master typically stood to a slave, and he had been speaking to her in a low voice that Catherine couldn't hear. The girl had been looking down, as slaves were supposed to do, but there had been something in her posture, a familiarity, a lack of fear, that had struck Catherine as wrong. Catherine had watched them for a moment, a strange feeling growing in her chest. Then Edmund had reached out and touched the girl's arm, just briefly, and the girl had looked up at him with an expression that Catherine couldn't quite read. That night, Catherine had asked Edmund about the girl. "That's Ruth," Edmund had said, not meeting her eyes. "She works in the kitchen." "Why do you ask? You seemed familiar with her," Catherine had said carefully. Edmund had stiffened. "She's a good worker. I've known her since she was a child. Her mother was my father's cook." There had been something in his tone, something defensive that had told Catherine everything she needed to know. She hadn't pressed the issue. She was a new bride, still finding her footing in her new home. She didn't want to start her marriage with an accusation. And besides, she had told herself, surely she was imagining things, surely Edmund wouldn't. But 3 months later, in January of 1837, Ruth had given birth to a son. Catherine had been in the main house when she heard the news from one of the other house slaves, a baby boy. Born in the quarters the night before, Ruth's first child. Catherine had felt a strange compulsion to see the baby. She had walked down to the quarters, something she rarely did, and had asked to see Ruth and her new son. Ruth had been lying on a pallet in her cabin, exhausted from the birth. The baby had been wrapped in a rough blanket, sleeping in a basket beside her. "Let me see him," Catherine had said. Ruth had hesitated, then had carefully lifted the baby and handed him to Catherine. Catherine had looked down at the infant's face. He had been tiny, wrinkled, with the reddish skin of a newborn. His eyes had been closed. "Open your eyes, little one," Catherine had whispered, and as if in response, the baby had blinked and looked up at her. Blue eyes. Clear, pale blue eyes that were unmistakable even in a newborn. Catherine had felt the world tilt. She had looked at Ruth, who had been staring at the floor, her face carefully blank. She had looked back at the baby, at those impossible blue eyes. Edmund Hartwell had blue eyes. His father had blue eyes. His grandfather had blue eyes. It was a family trait passed down through generations of Hartwells, like the land itself. Catherine had handed the baby back to Ruth without a word, and had walked back to the main house. She had gone to her room, closed the door, and had sat on her bed shaking. Her husband had fathered a child with a slave. Her husband had betrayed her before she had even arrived at the plantation, and the evidence of that betrayal was now living in the quarters. A baby with Hartwell eyes. Catherine had wanted to scream. She had wanted to confront Edmund, to demand an explanation, to rage at the injustice of it all. But she had done none of those things. Because she was a Southern lady, and Southern ladies didn't acknowledge such things. They didn't speak of the children their husbands fathered with slave women. They didn't admit that the system they lived in created these situations. That white men had absolute power over enslaved women and used that power in ways that were never discussed in polite society. So, Catherine had done what many women in her position did. She had swallowed her rage, buried it deep, and had turned it on the people who couldn't fight back. She couldn't punish Edmund. He was her husband, the master of the plantation, a man of standing in the community. To accuse him would be to shame herself, to admit that she couldn't keep her husband satisfied, to expose her own humiliation to the world. She couldn't punish Ruth directly either. Ruth was just a slave property, and to harm her too obviously would raise questions. People might wonder why the mistress of the plantation had such a particular hatred for one kitchen slave. But she could make their lives difficult. She could assign Ruth the hardest tasks, the longest hours. She could make sure Ruth's rations were smaller, her clothing more threadbare. She could punish her for minor infractions that other slaves would be forgiven. And as Daniel grew older, as those blue eyes became more and more obvious, Catherine's hatred had focused on him. Daniel's earliest memories were of his mother's hands. Rough and scarred from years of kitchen work, but gentle when they touched his face. She would wake him before dawn, when the quarters were still dark and quiet, and they would walk together to the main house where she worked. While she prepared breakfast for the Hartwell family, Daniel would sit in a corner of the kitchen, trying to be invisible. Even as a small child, he had understood that he needed to be invisible. The other house slaves had been kind to him in their way. Old Bessie, who had been at Hartwell Plantation longer than anyone could remember, had sometimes slipped him bits of food. A piece of cornbread, a slice of ham. Samuel, who worked in the stable, had taught him how to curry horses and had let him help with small tasks. But there had always been a distance, a carefulness in how they treated him. They had known what his blue eyes meant, and they had known that association with him could be dangerous. When Daniel was 6 years old, he had been sent to work in the fields. It was young, but not unusually so. Slave children were expected to start contributing to the plantation's labor as soon as they were physically capable. He had started with simple tasks, carrying water to the field hands, picking up drop tobacco leaves, pulling weeds. As he grew older and stronger, the work had become harder: hoeing, planting, harvesting. The field work was brutal. In summer, the Virginia sun beat down mercilessly, and the humidity made the air feel thick enough to choke on. The tobacco plants grew tall, and working among them meant being surrounded by leaves that stuck to your skin and clothes. In spring and fall, the work was somewhat easier, but there was always something to do: preparing the seed beds, transplanting the seedlings, topping the plants, cutting and hanging the leaves to cure. The overseer, a man named Garrett, who had been hired by Edmund's father and kept on after the old man's death, was quick with the whip and slow with mercy. He was a tall, lean man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that seemed to take pleasure in finding fault. He would ride through the fields on his horse, watching the workers, looking for any excuse to punish someone. Daniel had learned quickly to work hard, to keep his head down, to never give Garrett a reason to single him out. But it hadn't always been enough. Garrett seemed to have a particular dislike for Daniel, and Daniel had received more than his share of whippings for infractions that other slaves would have been warned about, but not punished for. By the time Daniel was a teenager, he had scars on his back from Garrett's whip. He had learned to endure pain without crying out, because showing weakness only made things worse. He had learned to read Garrett's moods, to know when to work faster and when to stay out of sight. But the worst part wasn't Garrett. The worst part was Catherine. She would sometimes come out to the fields, ostensibly to check on the progress of the work. She would stand at the edge of the tobacco rows, shaded by a parasol, and she would watch. Daniel always knew when she was watching him specifically, because he could feel her gaze like a physical weight. She never spoke to him directly. That would have been beneath her dignity. But she would speak to Garrett, and Garrett would find reasons to punish Daniel. "That boy isn't working hard enough," she would say, pointing at Daniel. "That section of the field looks poorly maintained. Who's responsible for it? I saw one of the workers being lazy earlier. Make sure they understand that won't be tolerated." And Garrett, who understood exactly what Catherine wanted, even if she never said it explicitly, would oblige. Daniel had tried to understand why Catherine hated him so much. He knew it had something to do with his eyes, with the way they marked him as different, but he didn't fully understand the implications until he was about 15 years old, when one of the older slaves, a man named Joseph, had finally explained it to him. They had been working in the fields together, and Joseph had noticed Daniel staring at the main house where Catherine was visible on the veranda. "You know why she hates you, don't you?" Joseph had said quietly. Daniel had shaken his head. Joseph had looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then had spoken in a voice barely above a whisper. "Your eyes, boy. They're the master's eyes. You understand what that means." Daniel had felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had suspected, of course. He wasn't stupid, but having it said aloud was different. "The master is your father," Joseph had continued. "Everyone knows it. Can't hide eyes like that. And the mistress, she knows it too. That's why she hates you. You're proof of what the master did with your mother. Every time she sees you, she sees that proof." Daniel had wanted to ask more questions about his mother, about what had happened, about whether Edmund knew, but Joseph had already turned back to his work. The conversation was over. That night, Daniel had tried to talk to his mother about it. They had been sitting outside their cabin, eating their evening meal of cornmeal mush and a bit of salt pork. "Mama," he had said carefully, "is it true? Is the master my father?" Ruth had gone very still. For a long moment, she hadn't answered. Then she had set down her bowl and had looked at him with eyes that held more pain than he had ever seen. "Don't ask me that," she had said quietly. "Don't ever ask me that. But listen to me, Daniel," she had interrupted, her voice urgent. "Some things are better left unspoken. Some truths are too dangerous. You keep your head down, you do your work, and you survive. That's all that matters. Survival." She had never spoken of it again, and Daniel had learned not to ask. One of the strangest aspects of Daniel's life was watching Edmund's legitimate children grow up. Margaret, Ned, and Sarah Hartwell lived in a different world from Daniel, but their lives intersected with his in ways that were both mundane and deeply uncomfortable. Margaret, the eldest, had been born in 1838, just a year after Daniel. As a child, she had sometimes played in the yard where Daniel was working, and she had occasionally spoken to him with the thoughtless kindness of a child who didn't yet understand the full implications of slavery. But as she grew older and was educated in the ways of Southern society, she had learned to look through him as if he didn't exist. By the time she was 13, she had perfected the art of treating slaves as invisible furniture. Ned, born in 1840, had been different. He had inherited his father's stern demeanor and his mother's sharp tongue, and even as a child, he had enjoyed exercising what little power he had. He would order the slave children around, would report them to his mother for imaginary infractions, would sometimes throw rocks at them for entertainment. As he grew older, he had become more subtle in his cruelty, but no less effective. He seemed to have inherited Catherine's particular dislike for Daniel, and he would go out of his way to make Daniel's life difficult. Sarah, the youngest, was still too young in 1851 to have fully absorbed the prejudices of her society. She was 7 years old, and she sometimes still treated the slaves with a child's innocent friendliness. But Daniel knew that would change. It always did. The most painful moments were when Daniel would see Edmund with his legitimate children. Edmund was a distant father by modern standards, but he clearly loved his children. He would take Ned riding, teaching him about the plantation and preparing him to take over someday. He would bring gifts back from his trips to Richmond for the girls. He would sit with them in the parlor in the evenings, reading aloud or discussing their lessons. Daniel would sometimes see these moments from a distance, through a window or while working in the yard, and he would feel a complicated mix of emotions that he couldn't fully name. Longing, perhaps. Anger. Grief for something he had never had and never would have. Edmund never acknowledged Daniel, never spoke to him directly unless absolutely necessary, never looked at him for longer than a moment. It was as if Edmund had decided that the best way to handle the situation was to pretend Daniel didn't exist. And perhaps, Daniel thought, that was the kindest thing Edmund could do. Because acknowledging Daniel would mean acknowledging what he had done to Ruth, and that acknowledgement would destroy everything Edmund had built. The year before the murder, there had been a winter that everyone at Hartwell Plantation would remember. It had started snowing in late November, and hadn't stopped until February. The snow had piled up in drifts that reached the windows of the cabins in the quarters. The roads had become impassable, and the plantation had been cut off from Charlottesville for weeks at a time. The tobacco fields had lain dormant under a blanket of white, and the work had shifted to maintenance tasks, repairing buildings, mending tools, processing the previous year's tobacco crop in the curing barns. It had been a hard winter. The cabins in the quarters were poorly insulated, and keeping them warm had been a constant struggle. The rations had run low as the weeks stretched on, and supply trips to town became impossible. Several of the older slaves had fallen ill, and 2 had died. Old Bessie, who had been kind to Daniel when he was a child, and a man named Thomas, who had worked in the fields for 40 years. But the winter had also brought a strange kind of peace. With the roads closed and visitors unable to come to the plantation, the usual social pressures had eased. Catherine had stayed in the main house, and her opportunities to torment Daniel had been limited. Edmund had been preoccupied with keeping the plantation running through the difficult weather. And Ruth had fallen ill. It had started as a cough, the kind of thing that everyone got during the winter. But it had worsened, settling into her chest, making her breathing labored and painful. She had continued to work in the kitchen as long as she could, but eventually she had collapsed while preparing dinner one evening. Daniel had been terrified. He had carried his mother back to their cabin and had sat with her through the night, listening to her struggle to breathe, feeling helpless and afraid. The plantation had a doctor who would come to treat the slaves when necessary, not out of compassion, but because slaves were valuable property, and it made economic sense to keep them healthy. But the roads were closed, and the doctor couldn't come. Edmund had sent medicine from the main house, some kind of tonic, that was supposed to help with respiratory ailments. Daniel had given it to his mother faithfully 3 times a day and had prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. Ruth had survived, but it had been close. For 2 weeks, she had hovered between life and death, and Daniel had barely left her side except to do the minimum work required to avoid punishment. During those 2 weeks, sitting in the cold cabin and watching his mother fight for every breath, Daniel had realized something. Ruth was all he had in the world. She was the only person who loved him, the only connection he had to anything resembling family. If she died, he would be completely alone. The thought had terrified him more than anything else in his life. Ruth had eventually recovered, though she had never fully regained her strength. She had returned to work in the kitchen, but she moved more slowly now, and there was a fragility to her that hadn't been there before. And Daniel had become even more protective of her, even more careful to avoid giving Catherine any excuse to punish either of them. But careful wasn't always enough. March came to Virginia with unseasonable warmth that year. The snow melted rapidly, turning the roads to mud and the fields to soggy messes that would need weeks to dry out before planting could begin. The tobacco seedlings were already sprouting in their beds, tiny green shoots that would eventually be transplanted to the fields. The plantation was busy with the work of preparing for the growing season, repairing fences, checking equipment, organizing supplies. Edmund had business in Richmond that required his attention. There were contracts to negotiate, tobacco to sell from the previous year's crop, supplies to purchase for the coming season. He left on a Monday morning in mid-March, planning to be gone for a week. Before he left, he had given Catherine instructions for managing the plantation in his absence. It was routine. Catherine had done this many times before. She was perfectly capable of running the household and overseeing the slaves for a few days. But this time, something was different. Catherine had been in a strange mood for weeks. The slaves in the main house had noticed it. She was more irritable than usual, quicker to find fault, more prone to sudden rages over minor issues. "She's been sleeping poorly," they whispered to each other. They had heard her pacing in her room at night, heard her crying when she thought no one could hear. Something was eating at her, something beyond her usual bitterness. On the 3rd day after Edmund's departure, Catherine had called Garrett to the main house. They had spoken in Edmund's study for over an hour, and when Garrett had emerged, he had been smiling in a way that made the house slaves nervous. The next morning, Garrett had announced that Daniel was being reassigned from fieldwork to repair the stable. One of the horses had gone lame, and the stable needed work before the spring rains began in earnest. It was an unusual assignment. Daniel had always worked in the fields, and there were other slaves who knew more about carpentry. But no one questioned it. Garrett was the overseer, and his word was law. Daniel had reported to the stable that morning with his tools, a hammer, a saw, some nails that Garrett had given him. The stable was a large building behind the main house, with stalls for a dozen horses and a loft for storing hay. It smelled of horses and leather and old wood, and it was dim and cool even in the middle of the day. The work was straightforward enough. Several of the boards in the back wall had rotted and needed to be replaced. The roof had some leaks that needed patching. It was hard work, but not unbearable, and Daniel was grateful to be out of the fields, where Garrett's whip was always a possibility. He worked alone for 3 days, replacing boards and reinforcing stalls. The horses watched him with their large, gentle eyes, and he found their presence oddly comforting. Horses didn't care about the color of his eyes. They didn't hate him for existing. On the 4th day, Catherine came to inspect his progress. Daniel had been working on the back wall, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool air, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Catherine standing in the doorway of the stable, backlit by the afternoon sun. His heart sank. He set down his hammer and turned to face her, his eyes on the ground as he had been taught. "Stop," Catherine said, her voice cold and controlled. He stopped immediately, standing still, waiting. "Look at me," she said. It was a trap. He knew it was a trap. Slaves didn't look white women in the eye. It was one of the fundamental rules, one of the things that could get you whipped or worse. But she had given him a direct order, and disobeying would be worse than obeying. Slowly, Daniel raised his eyes to her face. Catherine stared at him for a long moment. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She was wearing a dark green dress, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken her maid an hour to create. She looked every inch the plantation mistress, the lady of the manor, but her eyes were wild. "Do you know what you are?" she asked, her voice low and intense. Daniel said nothing. There was no safe answer to that question. "You're an abomination," Catherine continued, taking a step closer. "A reminder of sin. Every time I see your face, I see proof of what your mother did. Seducing my husband, corrupting this household, destroying my marriage." Daniel kept his expression carefully blank, though his heart was pounding so hard, he thought she must be able to hear it. Ruth had never seduced anyone. They both knew that enslaved women had no power to refuse their masters. But Catherine needed to believe the lie, needed to place the blame anywhere except on her husband. "You should never have been born," Catherine said, and there was something in her voice now, something that sounded almost like grief. "You're a stain on this family, on this plantation, on everything we've built. Every time I look at you, I see those eyes." His eyes. The eyes that should belong only to my children, to legitimate Hartwells. But there you are, wearing them like a mockery. She was closer now, close enough that Daniel could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive. Her hands were clenched at her sides, and she was trembling slightly. "I have tried," she said, her voice rising. "I have tried for 15 years to pretend you don't exist, to look past you, to ignore what you represent. But I can't. I can't do it anymore. Every day you're here. Every day I have to see you and remember what he did, what she did, what you are." Daniel wanted to speak, wanted to defend himself, wanted to say that he hadn't asked to be born, that none of this was his fault. But he knew that speaking would only make things worse. Catherine stared at him for another long moment, and then something seemed to break in her. Her face crumpled, and for just a second, Daniel saw not the imperious plantation mistress, but a woman who was deeply, profoundly unhappy. "You should never have been born," she whispered again. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in the stable, his hands shaking. He should have known then that something terrible was coming. But he was 23 years old, and he had spent his entire life learning to endure. He thought he could endure this too. He was wrong. Edmund returned from Richmond on a Saturday evening, bringing gifts for his children and news of tobacco prices that had everyone in good spirits. The trip had been successful. He had negotiated favorable contracts and had made some new business connections that promised to be profitable. He was in a good mood, more relaxed than he had been in months. That night, the Hartwell family had dinner together in the main house. The dining room was lit by candles in silver candlesticks, and the table was laden with foodsy, roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the root cellar, a pie made from preserved peaches. The children chatted about their week, and Edmund listened with half an ear, while discussing business matters with Ned, who was old enough now to start learning about plantation management. From the slave quarters, everything seemed normal. The lights in the main house glowed warmly, and the sounds of conversation and laughter drifted across the yard. But the next morning, Catherine went to her husband's study and closed the door behind her. What was said in that room, no one knows for certain, but the slaves working in the house that day heard raised voices. They heard Catherine's sharp tone rising and falling in waves of anger. They heard Edmund's deeper rumble in response, trying to calm her, then growing angry himself. The argument lasted nearly an hour. Sarah, the cook who had replaced Ruth in the kitchen after Ruth had been demoted to other tasks, stood in the hallway and listened with growing dread. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the fury in Catherine's voice, the defensiveness in Edmund's. When Catherine finally emerged, her face was pale and set, her eyes red-rimmed. She walked past Sarah without acknowledging her and went upstairs to her room. Edmund followed a few minutes later, his expression grim. He went to his study and closed the door. And for the rest of the day, he saw no one. That afternoon, Edmund called Daniel to the main house. Daniel came immediately, his stomach tight with dread. He had been summoned to the main house only a handful of times in his life, and it was never for anything good. Edmund was waiting in his study, standing by the window with his back to the door. The study was a masculine room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk, covered with papers and account books. It smelled of tobacco and leather and old paper. Edmund didn't turn around when Daniel entered. "Your mother is being sold," Edmund said, his voice flat and emotionless. "There's a trader coming through next week. She'll go with him." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Sold. His mother was being sold. "Please, sir," Daniel said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Please don't. It's already decided." Edmund interrupted. He still hadn't turned around. "You'll stay here. You're a good worker, and we need you for the tobacco season. But she's getting old, and we don't need 2 kitchen slaves." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Ruth was 42 years old, still strong enough to work, still capable. There was no economic reason to sell her. This was punishment. This was Catherine's revenge, and Edmund was allowing it. "Sir, please," Daniel said again, and he heard the desperation in his own voice, the breaking of every rule he'd been taught about how a slave should speak to a master. "She's my mother. She's all I have. Please don't do this." Edmund finally turned around. For just a moment, Daniel saw something in his face. Guilt, perhaps. Or regret. Or maybe just wariness. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold authority of a man who owned other human beings and had learned not to think too hard about what that meant. "That's enough," Edmund said. "You're dismissed." Daniel left the study in a daze. His mind was reeling, trying to process what he had just been told. His mother was being sold. She would be taken away, and he would never see her again. He found Ruth in the laundry, washing clothes in a large tub of hot water. When he told her what was going to happen, she didn't cry. She just nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting this for years. "You have to be careful now," she told him, gripping his hands with her wet, work-roughened fingers. "More careful than ever. She wants to hurt you, Daniel. She's wanted to hurt you since the day you were born. Selling me is just the beginning. Don't give her a reason. Don't fight back. Just survive. Promise me you'll survive." Daniel promised, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. But it was already too late for careful. The trader arrived on a Thursday morning, driving a wagon with iron chains rattling in the back. His name was Silas Cobb, and he was a familiar figure in Virginia, a man who made his living buying and selling human beings. He was in his 50s with a weathered face and cold eyes that assessed people the way a horse trader might assess livestock. Edmund met him in the yard and conducted the transaction with business-like efficiency. They discussed price. Ruth was past her prime, but she was healthy and experienced, worth perhaps 400. They settled on 375 and Edmund accepted payment in cash. Ruth was given 10 minutes to gather her few possessions, a spare dress, a blanket, a small wooden box that contained the only things she owned that had any personal meaning. A button from a dress her mother had worn, a smooth stone Daniel had given her when he was 5 years old, a scrap of ribbon. Daniel stood in the yard and watched as his mother climbed into the wagon. She was wearing her best dress, the one she wore to the slave church services on Sunday evenings. Her face was composed, her back straight. She didn't look at Daniel as the wagon pulled away. It was a mercy, he thought later. If she had looked at him, he might have done something foolish. As it was, he stood frozen until the wagon disappeared down the road. And then he walked back to the fields and picked up his hoe and went to work, because there was nothing else he could do. But something inside him had broken. The other slaves in the quarters understood what had happened, and they left Daniel alone with his grief. They had all lost people. Parents, children, spouses, siblings. Sold away to distant plantations where they would never be seen again. It was one of the fundamental cruelties of slavery, the way it tore families apart as casually as you might tear a piece of paper. That night, Daniel sat outside his cabin and stared at the stars. The cabin felt impossibly empty without his mother. For 23 years, she had been the one constant in his life, the one person who loved him unconditionally. And now she was gone. Sold south to Georgia, where the cotton plantations worked slaves to death in a matter of years. He thought about running. He could try to make it north to freedom, but he knew he wouldn't make it far. A slave running from a plantation in Virginia would be hunted down within days, and the punishment for running was severe whipping, branding, sometimes death. He thought about confronting Catherine, about demanding to know why she had done this, but that would only give her satisfaction, and it would probably get him killed. So he did what his mother had told him to do. He survived. He went to work the next day, and the day after that, moving through his tasks like a ghost, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, just enduring. But Catherine wasn't satisfied with just removing Ruth. Because every time she saw Daniel, she still saw those blue eyes. She still saw the proof of her husband's betrayal. And she realized that as long as he was alive, she would never be free of the reminder. 2 weeks after Ruth was sold, Catherine made another decision. On a warm evening in late April, Edmund had gone to Charlottesville for a meeting with his banker. There were some financial matters to discuss. Loans, investments, the usual business of running a large plantation. He planned to return before dark. Catherine spent the day in the house, pacing from room to room, her mood growing darker as the hours passed. The house slaves stayed out of her way, recognizing the signs of one of her bad days. As evening approached, Catherine sent word to the quarters that Daniel was to come to the main house. There was a broken window in one of the guest bedrooms that needed boarding up before the night rains came. Daniel came carrying his tools, his face carefully neutral. He had been avoiding the main house as much as possible since his mother's sale, but he couldn't refuse a direct summons. Catherine met him at the back door and led him upstairs to one of the guest bedrooms. The room was rarely used, furnished with a bed and a dresser and little else. The window was indeed broken. A branch had fallen against it during the last storm, cracking the glass and breaking the frame. Daniel set to work measuring the frame for a board. trying to ignore Catherine's presence. She stood in the doorway, watching him, and the silence was oppressive. "Your mother is in Georgia by now," Catherine said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence like a stone thrown through glass. "Did you know that?" The trader sold her to a cotton plantation outside Savannah. They work slaves to death on those places. 12, 14 hours a day in the fields. The heat is unbearable. The overseers are brutal. She probably won't last a year. Daniel's hands stilled on his tools. He forced himself to keep breathing, to stay calm. "They say cotton is harder than tobacco," Catherine continued, her voice taking on a strange, dreamy quality. "The plants are lower to the ground, so you have to bend over all day. Your back never stops hurting, and the cotton bolls cut your hands when you pick them. By the end of the season, your fingers are bleeding and scarred." Daniel turned to face her, unable to stop himself. "Why are you telling me this?" It was the first time he had ever spoken to her directly, and he saw her eyes widen with shock and then narrow with fury. "How dare you speak to me?" she hissed. "How dare you look at me with those eyes?" "I didn't ask for these eyes," Daniel said, and he was surprised by how calm his voice sounded. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be born." It was the wrong thing to say. Catherine's face contorted with rage. She stepped into the room, and her hand went to the pocket of her dress. When it emerged, she was holding a small pistol. A lady's gun, the kind wealthy women kept for protection. It was a percussion cap pistol, small enough to fit in a pocket or a reticule, but deadly at close range. "You dare speak to me like that," she said, her voice shaking. "You dare look at me with those eyes." With his eyes, Daniel raised his hands, backing away. "Mom, please. You're going to disappear," Catherine said, and her voice was eerily calm now, as if she had thought this through carefully. "There's going to be an accident. You're going to fall from the roof while doing repairs. Or maybe you'll try to run away and get lost in the woods. These things happen to slaves all the time. No one will question it. No one will care." She raised the pistol, her hand shaking. The barrel was pointed at Daniel's chest, and he could see her finger on the trigger. "You're a mistake," Catherine said. "An error that should be erased, and I'm going to erase you." Daniel looked at the gun, at Catherine's face, at the door behind her that was too far away to reach. He thought about his mother, sold south to die in a cotton field. He thought about all the years of hatred and cruelty, all the pain that Catherine had inflicted on him for the crime of existing, and something in him snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing for the gun. They struggled, crashing against the wall. Catherine was surprisingly strong, fueled by rage and desperation. She clawed at his face with her free hand, and he felt her nails rake across his cheek. He grabbed her wrist, trying to force the gun away, and they spun around, knocking over the dresser. The gun went off with a deafening crack that seemed to fill the entire room. For a moment, neither of them moved. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and choking. Then Catherine stumbled backward, her hand going to her chest. Blood was spreading across the front of her dress, dark and wet, soaking into the fabric. She looked down at the wound, then up at Daniel, her eyes wide with shock and something that might have been disbelief. "You," she started to say, but the words turned into a gurgle. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. She collapsed to the floor, her body hitting the wooden boards with a heavy thud. Daniel stood frozen, the pistol still in his hand, staring at what he had done. His mind was racing, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to figure out what to do. Catherine Hartwell was dead. He had killed her. It had been self-defense. She had been trying to murder him. But that wouldn't matter. A slave who killed a white woman would be hanged. No questions asked, no trial necessary. He could run. He could try to make it to the north, to freedom. But he knew he wouldn't make it far. A slave running from a murder would be hunted down within days, and the punishment would be swift and brutal. He could try to claim self-defense, but who would believe a slave over a white woman? Even dead Catherine's word would carry more weight than his. There was no good choice. There was no way out. He was still standing there, paralyzed with shock, when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Edmund had come home early. Edmund appeared in the doorway and took in the scene, his wife's body on the floor. The blood, Daniel holding the pistol, the overturned furniture, the broken window. For a long moment, father and son, though neither would ever acknowledge that relationship, stared at each other. Daniel found his voice first. "She was going to kill me," he said, his voice hoarse. "She had the gun. We struggled. It went off. I didn't mean." "Stop," Edmund said quietly. He walked over to Catherine's body and knelt beside her. He touched her neck, checking for a pulse, though it was obvious she was dead. Then he gently closed her eyes, his hand lingering on her face for a moment. When he stood up, his expression was unreadable. He looked at Daniel, at the pistol in his hand, at the blood on his shirt. "Go back to the quarters," Edmund said quietly. "Don't speak to anyone. I'll handle this." Daniel stared at him. "Sir." "Go," Edmund repeated, and there was something in his voice. Not kindness exactly, but not cruelty either. Just exhaustion. "I'll handle this." Daniel set the pistol down carefully on the dresser and walked out of the room, down the stairs, and back to the slave quarters in a daze. He expected to be arrested within the hour. He expected a mob, a quick trial, a hanging. But none of that happened. Instead, Edmund Hartwell called for the doctor and the sheriff. And when they arrived, he told them a story. His wife had been despondent lately, he said. She had been suffering from melancholy, from dark moods that he hadn't fully understood. That evening, while he was in town, she had taken a pistol to one of the upstairs rooms and shot herself. It was a tragedy, a terrible, senseless tragedy. The doctor, a man named Harrison who had known the Hartwell family for years, examined the body. The wound was consistent with Edmund's story, a single gunshot to the chest, close range. The gun was there on the dresser where Edmund had placed it after Daniel had left. The sheriff, a man named Wilkins who had served with Edmund in the Mexican War, accepted the explanation without much question. Suicide was a shameful thing, but it happened even in the best families, and Edmund Hartwell was a respected man, a pillar of the community. His word was beyond question. "I'm sorry for your loss, Edmund," Sheriff Wilkins said, placing a hand on Edmund's shoulder. "This must be devastating for you and the children." "Thank you," Edmund said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine grief. "I should have seen the signs, should have done something." "You can't blame yourself," the doctor said. "Melancholy is a disease of the mind. There's often nothing that can be done." They made arrangements for the body to be prepared for burial. They discussed how to break the news to the children, who were staying with neighbors that evening. They talked about the funeral arrangements, about who should be notified. No one mentioned Daniel. No one asked if any of the slaves had seen or heard anything. It simply didn't occur to them that a slave might be involved. Catherine Hartwell was buried 3 days later in the family cemetery, a small plot surrounded by an iron fence on a hill overlooking the tobacco fields. The whole county turned out for the funeral. The Episcopal minister gave a moving eulogy about the tragedy of a life cut short, about the mysteries of God's will, about the comfort of knowing that Catherine was now at peace. Edmund stood at the graveside, his face grave and dignified, his children beside him. Margaret was crying quietly. Ned was trying to be stoic, and little Sarah didn't fully understand what was happening. Edmund accepted condolences from neighbors and friends, thanked them for coming, maintained his composure throughout the entire ordeal. No one questioned the story. No one suspected the truth. And Daniel, who had expected to die, found himself still alive, still working in the fields, still enslaved, but breathing. The weeks following Catherine's death were strange and surreal. The plantation went into mourning, with black crepe hung on the doors and the family wearing black clothing. The usual social activities were suspended, and visitors came to pay their respects and offer condolences. Daniel went about his work in a state of numb disbelief. He kept expecting someone to come for him, to accuse him, to drag him away to be hanged. But no one did. Edmund never spoke to him, never looked at him directly, never gave any sign that anything had changed. In the quarters, the other slaves whispered among themselves. They knew something had happened. The timing was too convenient. Catherine's death too sudden. But they didn't know the details, and Daniel didn't tell them. He had learned long ago that some secrets were too dangerous to share. Ruth's absence was a constant ache. Daniel would sometimes forget for a moment that she was gone, and he would turn to tell her something before remembering. The cabin felt empty and cold without her presence. He wondered if she had heard about Catherine's death. He wondered if she was still alive, if the cotton plantation in Georgia was as brutal as Catherine had described. He wondered if he would ever see her again. He knew the answer to that last question was no. 2 months passed. The tobacco was planted, and the fields turned green with new growth. The plantation settled into its summer routine. Edmund hired a new housekeeper, a widow from Charlottesville, to help manage the household and look after the children. Life went on, and then, in early July, Edmund quietly arranged for Daniel to be sold. The sale was recorded in the county records as a routine business transaction. Daniel was sold to a farmer named William Preston, who owned a small farm in the western part of Virginia near the Allegheny Mountains. The price was $600, which was a good price for a young, strong field hand. Edmund never explained why he was selling Daniel. He never spoke to Daniel about what had happened in the upstairs bedroom, never acknowledged the secret they shared. But Daniel understood. He understood that Edmund couldn't keep him at Hartwell Plantation, not after what had happened. Every time Edmund saw Daniel, he would be reminded of Catherine's death, of the lie he had told, of the secret he was keeping. And perhaps Edmund also understood that Daniel couldn't stay, that living at Hartwell Plantation with all its memories and pain would slowly destroy him. So Edmund sent him away, to a new place, a new beginning. Daniel left Hartwell Plantation on a summer morning, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a small bundle of possessions. He rode in a wagon with William Preston, a quiet man in his 50s who asked few questions and seemed content to let Daniel be. As the wagon pulled away, Daniel looked back at the plantation one last time. He saw the main house with its white columns, the tobacco fields stretching toward the mountains, the quarters where he had spent his entire life. He never saw Edmund again. The farm in western Virginia was different from Hartwell Plantation in almost every way. It was smaller, only about 100 acres, and Preston worked it with just 4 slaves, including Daniel. The work was more varied than tobacco farming. There were corn and wheat fields, a vegetable garden, some livestock. Preston was a hands-on farmer who worked alongside his slaves, and he was neither particularly cruel nor particularly kind. He was simply a man trying to make a living from the land. Daniel threw himself into the work, grateful for the physical exhaustion that kept him from thinking too much. The other slaves on Preston's farm were curious about him. where he had come from, why he had been sold, but they didn't push when he didn't want to talk about it. The years passed. Daniel worked, survived, endured. He learned new skills: how to plow with oxen, how to harvest wheat, how to repair farm equipment. He grew older, stronger, more silent. He thought about his mother often, wondered if she was still alive. He thought about Edmund, about the secret they shared, about the strange mercy Edmund had shown him. He thought about Catherine, about the hatred in her eyes, about the moment when the gun had gone off. He tried not to think about what his life might have been like if things had been different. That way lay madness. In April of 1861, the war came. Virginia seceded from the Union, and suddenly the whole South was mobilizing for war. William Preston joined the Confederate Army, leaving his farm in the care of his wife and his slaves. The farm struggled without him. There weren't enough hands to do all the work, and supplies became scarce as the war dragged on. In 1863, Union forces pushed into western Virginia. The area around Preston's farm became contested territory, with both armies moving through, requisitioning supplies, burning crops, destroying property. And in the chaos of war, Daniel saw an opportunity. One night in August of 1863, when Union soldiers were camped near the farm, Daniel walked away. He simply walked out of the cabin where he had been sleeping, walked past the farmhouse, walked down the road toward the Union camp. He expected to be stopped, to be shot, to be captured and returned. But no one stopped him. The war had made everything uncertain, had broken down the old systems and structures. He reached the Union camp and told the soldiers he wanted to join the army. They looked at him skeptically. He was 35 years old, which was old for a soldier. But they were desperate for men, and they weren't turning anyone away. Daniel was enlisted in the 5th United States Colored Infantry, a regiment of black soldiers fighting for the Union. The recruiting officer noted his unusual eye color in the records, a detail that seemed worth recording. For the next 2 years, Daniel fought in the war. He marched through Virginia and North Carolina, participated in battles whose names would be recorded in history books, saw men die in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But he also saw slavery die. He saw plantations burned, saw slaves freed, saw the old order crumbling. And when the war finally ended in April of 1865, Daniel was still alive. After the war, Daniel didn't know where to go. He had no family, no home, no connections. He was a free man, but freedom without resources was a precarious thing. He drifted north, working odd jobs, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings. He eventually made his way to Pennsylvania, where there were communities of formerly enslaved people who had built new lives for themselves. In a small town outside Pittsburgh, Daniel found work as a carpenter. The skills he had learned at Hartwell Plantation and Preston's farm served him well. He was good with his hands, reliable, hardworking. He took a new surname, as many formerly enslaved people did. He chose Harris, a common name, unremarkable, carrying no weight of history or shame. Daniel Harris. It felt like a new beginning. He never married, never had children. He lived quietly, worked steadily, kept to himself. He didn't talk about his past, didn't tell anyone about the plantation in Virginia, or the woman he had killed, or the secret he carried. But sometimes, late at night, he would think about his mother. He would wonder if she had survived the cotton plantation in Georgia, if she had lived to see freedom. He hoped she had. He hoped that somewhere, somehow, she had found peace. He never tried to find out. Some questions were better left unanswered. In 1870, the census taker came through the town where Daniel was living. The census was part of the government's effort to count and document the newly freed population, to understand the demographic changes that the war had brought. The census taker recorded Daniel's information. Daniel Harris, age 42, born in Virginia, occupation carpenter, race colored. And in the space for distinguishing characteristics, the census taker noted, blue eyes, unusual. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but it was there in the records, preserved for anyone who cared to look. Daniel lived for another 23 years. He died in 1893 at the age of 65 of pneumonia. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Pittsburgh, in a grave marked with a simple stone that read, Daniel Harris, 1828 to 1893. No one came to his funeral except the minister and the undertaker. He had lived alone and died alone, and whatever secrets he carried went with him to the grave. Back in Virginia, the Hartwell plantation had not survived the war intact. Union forces had occupied the area in 1864, and the plantation had been used as a staging ground for military operations. The tobacco fields had been trampled, the barns burned, the livestock requisitioned. Edmund Hartwell had died in 1867, just 2 years after the war ended. His obituary, in the Charlottesville newspaper, praised him as a pillar of the community, a man of honor and dignity who had served his country in the Mexican War and had managed his affairs with integrity throughout his life. The obituary made no mention of Catherine's death, no mention of the scandal that had been carefully buried along with her body. It made no mention of Daniel or Ruth or any of the 43 people who had been enslaved at Hartwell Plantation. Edmund's son, Ned, had tried to keep the plantation running after his father's death, but it was a losing battle. The economy of the South was in ruins. The labor system had been completely upended, and the debts were crushing. In 1872, Ned sold the plantation to pay off creditors. The new owners divided the land into smaller parcels and sold them off. The main house stood empty for years, slowly deteriorating. In 1889, it was torn down, and the materials were salvaged for other building projects. Today, there's nothing left of Hartwell Plantation except a historical marker on a country road outside Charlottesville. The marker notes that a prominent Virginia family once lived there, that the plantation was active from the late 1700s until after the Civil War. It doesn't mention Catherine's death. It doesn't mention Daniel. It doesn't mention any of the enslaved people who lived and worked and died there. The slave quarters are long gone, plowed under and forgotten. The family cemetery still exists, surrounded by its iron fence, but it's overgrown with weeds, and the headstones are weathered and hard to read. Catherine's grave is there, marked with a stone that reads, Catherine Beaumont Hartwell, 1814-1851, beloved wife and mother. Edmund's grave is beside hers, Colonel Edmund Hartwell, 1804-1867. A man of honor. The irony of that epitaph is lost on anyone who doesn't know the full story. But the records remain. In the Albemarle County Courthouse, in boxes of old documents that few people ever look at. The evidence exists for anyone who cares to search for it. There's the record of Ruth's sale in March of 1851, noting that she was sold to a trader named Silas Cobb for $375. There's the record of Catherine's death in April of 1851, officially listed as suicide. There's the record of Daniel's sale in July of 1851, noting that he was sold to William Preston of Augusta County for $600. And if you look carefully, if you cross-reference these records with other documents, patterns begin to emerge. Questions begin to form. Why would Edmund Hartwell suddenly sell a healthy, middle-aged kitchen slave in March of 1851? Why would his wife die just a few weeks later? Why would he then sell a young, strong field hand, one of his most valuable slaves, just 2 months after that? The timing is suspicious. The sequence of events raises questions. But without someone to ask those questions, without someone to connect the dots, the truth remains buried in the records, invisible to casual observers. Historians who have studied Albemarle County in the antebellum period have occasionally noted these transactions, but they've never put the pieces together. They've never realized that these three separate events were all connected, that they were all part of a single story of jealousy, murder, and desperate attempts to hide the truth. And even if they did realize it, what would they do with that knowledge? The people involved are long dead. The plantation is gone. The only witnesses were enslaved people whose testimony was never recorded, whose voices were never heard. The story exists in fragments, in hints and suggestions, in the gaps between official records. What are we to make of this story? What does it tell us about the world of 1851 Virginia? About the system of slavery? About the people who lived within that system? Edmund Hartwell was, by the standards of his time and place, a respectable man. He was a successful planter, a veteran, a pillar of his community. He went to church. He paid his debts. He managed his affairs with what was considered integrity. But he also owned human beings. He fathered a child with an enslaved woman who had no power to refuse him. And when his wife tried to murder that child, Edmund covered up the crime to protect his family's reputation. Was he a good man or a bad man? The question is almost meaningless. He was a man of his time, shaped by the values and assumptions of his society, participating in a system that was fundamentally evil, but that he had been taught to see as natural and inevitable. Catherine Hartwell was a victim of that same system. She had been raised to believe that her worth came from her marriage, from her ability to manage a household and produce legitimate heirs. When her husband betrayed her with a slave woman, she had no recourse, no way to express her anger except by tormenting the powerless. Her jealousy and rage were understandable, even if her actions were not. She was trapped in a marriage and a society that gave her status, but not power, respect but not autonomy, and she took out her frustration on people who had even less power than she did. And Daniel was simply trying to survive. He didn't ask to be born. He didn't ask for the blue eyes that marked him as different. He didn't ask for any of the suffering that defined his life. When Catherine tried to kill him, he fought back. It was self-defense, pure and simple. But in the world of 1851 Virginia, self-defense was not a right that enslaved people possessed. If Edmund hadn't covered up the crime, Daniel would have been hanged. No questions asked. Edmund's decision to protect Daniel, to lie about Catherine's death, to send Daniel away to a new life, that was the closest thing to justice that was possible in that time and place. It wasn't real justice. Real justice would have meant Daniel never being enslaved in the first place. Would have meant Ruth never being raped by her master. Would have meant a society that didn't treat human beings as property. But within the constraints of the system, Edmund did what he could. He saved Daniel's life, even if he couldn't acknowledge him as a son. The story of Daniel, Ruth, Catherine, and Edmund is not unique. Across the South, on thousands of plantations, similar dramas played out. White men fathered children with enslaved women. White wives seethed with jealousy and took out their anger on the powerless. Families were torn apart by sales. Violence simmered beneath the surface of civilized society. Most of these stories were never recorded. Most of the people involved left no trace in the historical record. They lived, suffered, and died in obscurity. Their stories lost to time. Daniel's story survived only because of a few details that happened to be recorded: the unusual eye color, noted by a census taker, the timing of sales and deaths in county records, the service record from the Civil War. Even then, the full story has to be pieced together from fragments, from educated guesses, from reading between the lines of official documents. But the story matters. It matters because it reminds us that history is not just about great men and famous battles, and important political events. It's also about ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, trying to survive, trying to maintain their humanity in a system designed to strip it away. Daniel survived. He lived to see slavery end. He lived to see freedom, even if that freedom came late and was never complete. His mother, Ruth, probably didn't. The cotton plantations of Georgia were notorious for working slaves to death. If she survived until the end of the war, she would have been in her 50s, worn out from years of brutal labor. She probably died before freedom came. But we don't know for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. So much of the history of enslaved people is uncertain, fragmentary, lost. What we do know is this: they existed. They lived. They loved and suffered and endured. And their stories, even when we can only glimpse them in fragments, deserve to be told. In 1920, a researcher studying census records in Pennsylvania came across an interesting entry from 1870. A man named Daniel Harris, listed as a carpenter born in Virginia, with a notation about unusual blue eyes. The researcher was studying patterns of migration after the Civil War, tracking how formerly enslaved people had moved north and built new communities. The notation about eye color caught her attention. It was unusual for census takers to record such details. She tried to find more information about Daniel Harris, but there was almost nothing. No birth record. Slaves weren't given birth certificates. No marriage record. He apparently never married. Just the census entry, a brief mention in a city directory from 1875, and a death certificate from 1893. The researcher noted the information in her files and moved on. She never knew the full story. She never connected Daniel Harris to the Hartwell plantation in Virginia, never learned about Catherine's death or Ruth's sale or the secret that Edmund had kept. The blue eyes remained a curiosity, a small mystery in the larger tapestry of history. But the eyes had meant everything. They had marked Daniel as different, had made him a target of hatred, had nearly gotten him killed. They had been a curse and a burden, a constant reminder of a truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. And yet, in the end, those eyes had also been a kind of gift. They had made Daniel memorable enough that a census taker had noted them. They had left a trace in the historical record, a thread that could be followed, a story that could be told. The blue eyes had been proof of Edmund's sin, evidence of a system that allowed white men to rape enslaved women with impunity. But they had also been proof of Daniel's existence, of his humanity, of the fact that he had lived and survived and mattered. In the end, perhaps that's all any of us can hope for, to leave some trace, some evidence that we were here, that our lives meant something. Daniel left those blue eyes in the historical record, and through them, his story survives. This story shows us that the past is never as simple as we'd like it to be. There are no clear heroes or villains, just people making choices within the constraints of their time and place. There is suffering and cruelty, but also survival and resilience. There are secrets buried in official records, waiting for someone to piece them together. And there are questions that can never be fully answered, truths that remain forever uncertain. Did this really happen? The historical records suggest that something very much like this happened somewhere in Virginia, sometime in the years before the Civil War. The details may be different. The names may be changed. But the fundamental story of jealousy, murder, and the brutal realities of slavery is all too real. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are still secrets buried in those old records? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark historical mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves untold stories from America's past. See you in the next video.